The morning Georgia Lockhart drove the last fence post into the hard red earth of the Texas Panhandle. Her hands were bleeding and her back ached like she had been wrung out and left to dry in the August sun. But she did not stop, because stopping was something she had given up the luxury of doing the day they buried her husband in the rocky soil behind the barn. That had been 14 months ago. 14 months of learning to do everything a man was supposed to do, and a woman was supposed to do all at once, stretched across 240 acres of grazing land and wheat field that Robert Lockhart had purchased with his own blood and dreams in the spring of 1882. The land was in the Texas Panhandle, out near the town of Clarendon, where the sky was so wide it made a person feel both magnificent and terribly small at the same time. Robert had loved that sky. Georgia had loved Robert. And now she had the sky and the land and nothing else, except her 10-year-old daughter Nora, who followed her mother around the property with large, solemn eyes and the particular kind of silence that belonged to children who had seen too much grief too early. The fence line needed replacing because cattle from the property east of hers had been coming through the old rotted posts for 3 weeks running, eating down her winter wheat before it had a chance to establish itself. She had gone twice to speak to the foreman of the Aldridge Ranch, a man named Cutter Price who smelled of tobacco and spoke to her in the slow, patient way of a man, explaining something simple to someone he considered even simpler. He had promised to fix the problem. He had not fixed the problem, so Georgia fixed it herself. She had spent 2 days hauling cedar posts from the mill in Clarendon, loading them herself into the wagon, driving them back alone. She had spent a 3rd day studying the line of broken and leaning posts, measuring where each new one needed to go, marking the soil with a length of rope. On the 4th day she began digging, using a post-hole digger she had borrowed from her neighbor to the north, a widow woman named Edna Marsh who had been widowed herself and who looked at Georgia with a kind of grim approval when she came asking. She was on the 43rd post when the rider appeared. He came from the west, along the road that ran parallel to the property line, on a roan horse the color of dried blood. Georgia straightened and watched him come without putting down her mallet. In her experience, men who appeared on the road while a woman was working alone on a fence line were either bringing trouble or nosiness, and she was not in the mood for either. She tucked a loose strand of dark brown hair back under her hat brim and waited. He pulled his horse to a stop at a reasonable distance, which she noted as a point in his favor. He was perhaps 30 or 31 years old, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate irregularly, with a jaw that needed a razor's attention and dark eyes that were direct without being rude. He wore a battered hat and a canvas work coat, and there was a bedroll and a saddlebag behind him that suggested he was traveling rather than settled anywhere in particular. He looked at the fence line. He looked at her. Then he looked at the fence line again with the expression of a man who was doing a private calculation he wasn't sure he believed the answer to. "That your work?" he asked. "It is," Georgia said. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him counting the posts, following them with his eyes across the flat, dry ground until they reached the tree line in the distance. "How many posts is that?" he asked. 43 so far," she said. "I have 11 more to set." He was quiet again, not the uncomfortable quiet of a man who had nothing to say, but the quiet of a man who was genuinely thinking, and she found she did not mind it the way she minded most silences imposed by strangers. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, and there was nothing patronizing in it. It was a straightforward question, the kind one working person asks another. Georgia looked at the post in front of her. She looked at the mallet in her bleeding hands. She looked at the long line of cedar posts marching across the property line like soldiers she had personally recruited and placed. "Necessity," she said. The man nodded slowly, as if this was an answer that satisfied him completely. He stepped down from his horse in the easy, unhurried way of a man who had spent most of his life getting on and off horses, and he looped the reins around his saddle horn without tying them, trusting the animal to stay. He walked toward her without asking permission, which might have annoyed her, but he stopped several feet away and looked at the post she had been working on. "You've got this one leaning about 2 degrees east," he said. "Wind from the north will push it worse by winter." Georgia looked at it. He was right. She said nothing for a moment. "I was going to correct it before I tamped," she said. "I know," he said. "I wasn't criticizing." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and found that his expression bore out what he'd said. He was not criticizing. He was just talking about a fence post the way a person talks about a fence post when they know what they are looking at. "I'm Abel Haskins," he said. "I'm looking for work in this county. Heard there might be something at the Aldridge operation, but I haven't stopped in yet." Georgia absorbed this. The Aldridge operation was the very ranch whose cattle kept coming through her fence line. She considered this coincidence for a moment and decided it was just a coincidence. "Georgia Lockhart," she said, "this is my land." "Yes, ma'am," he said. He looked at the post-hole digger. He looked at the remaining 11 stakes she had driven into the ground to mark the spots. "You mind if I help with the rest?" She had been about to say no. She had been nose away from habit with that word, particularly when it involved men offering help that came with assumptions attached. But there was something in the straightforwardness of him that made her hesitate, and in that hesitation she heard Edna Marsh's voice from weeks ago saying, "Georgia, you don't have to do everything alone just to prove you can do everything alone." "I'll pay you a fair wage," she said, because that felt like the right way to accept help. Like a business arrangement rather than charity. He shook his head. "I've got nowhere to be this afternoon," he said. "Let me just help." She did not argue further. She handed him the post-hole digger because her arms were tired, and he took it without comment and began on the 44th hole as if they had been working together for years. They did not talk much while they worked. This suited Georgia. She was not by nature a quiet woman, but she had become one since Robert died, conserving her words the way she conserved everything else, spending them only where they were needed. Abel worked steadily and without drama, and he was strong in a way that was useful rather than showy. And when the light began to change from afternoon gold to evening orange, they had set all 11 remaining posts and tamped them solid. Georgia stood back and looked at the line. It was good work. It was straight and it was solid, and it would hold through the winter and beyond. And something inside her chest that had been clenched tight since the first Aldridge cattle came through eased itself just slightly. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in the full weight of those 2 words. Abel was washing his hands in the water bucket she'd brought from the barn, and he looked up at her. "It's good fence," he said. "You set the first 43 well. The tamping was even." She noted that he had paid attention. Most people who came to help her on the farm offered praise in the vague, generous way you praised a child, saying things were wonderful without actually looking at them. Abel had looked. "I'll offer you supper," she said, "for your trouble." He accepted this with a nod, and she noticed he waited for her to lead the way toward the house rather than walking ahead of her, which was the kind of small courtesy that either came naturally to a person or didn't. And she had learned to trust those small courtesies as indicators of larger character. The house was modest, but Georgia kept it clean and well ordered in the way of a woman who understood that order was its own kind of comfort. She had a kitchen garden behind the house that she maintained with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. And she cooked a simple but good meal of salt pork and roasted corn and bread she had made that morning. And there was coffee that was strong and real, not the chicory substitute that hard times sometimes demanded. Nora ate her supper quietly and watched Abel with the direct, evaluating stare of a child who has learned not to trust strangers easily. Abel did not try to charm the child or perform for her. He simply ate and occasionally said something honest and brief, and Georgia watched her daughter slowly relax the way a caught animal relaxes when it realizes it is not in danger. "You ride alone?" Nora asked eventually, in the way children ask questions directly and without preamble. "I do," Abel said. "Our papa rode alone sometimes," Nora said. "Mama doesn't like it." "Nora," Georgia said quietly. "It's all right," Abel said. He looked at Nora with the same directness he used with everyone. "Your mama's right to worry. A man ought to know where he's headed before he sets out." "Do you know where you're headed?" Nora asked. He paused for a moment. "Not entirely," he said, "but I'm looking." After supper, Georgia walked with him to where his horse was tied at the porch rail, and the evening air was cool and smelled of dust and dry grass and the particular emptiness of the Panhandle in September. The stars were beginning and the sky was going from purple to black at the edges. "If you need work," Georgia said, stopping herself before she continued, thinking about what she was offering, "I could use a hand here. I have cattle that need tending through the fall and winter. I can't pay much, but there's board and meals." She had surprised herself saying it. She had not been planning to say it. But the fence line was in her mind and the cattle were in her mind, and the list of things she had not yet managed to do because she only had 2 hands was also in her mind. And Abel Haskins had proven himself to be a person who worked hard and paid attention and did not condescend. He looked at her for a moment. "You'd need to think on that more than one evening," he said. "I have thought on it," she said. "I've been thinking on hiring someone for 3 months, and I haven't done it because I haven't found anyone I'd trust. You said 11 fence posts this afternoon, and you didn't once look at me like I was foolish for needing them set." Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, but she caught it, a kind of recognition. "All right," he said, "I'll stay and see how it goes." "There's a bunk in the barn," she said. "It's clean." "I'm not particular," he said. He wasn't. That was the first thing she learned about Abel Haskins. He was not particular about comfort, and he was not particular about credit, and he was not particular about whether anyone noticed when he worked or how hard he worked, which was itself a kind of rarity in her experience of men. Over the following weeks the work was relentless and real, and it bound them together in the way that shared labor does, with an honesty that social situations rarely produce. Georgia learned that Abel was from Kansas originally, from a small farm town called Benton, that he had worked cattle drives on the Western Trail route since he was 19, and that he had come to the Texas Panhandle because the drives were changing, the railroads were eating the old trails, and a man who wanted to stay relevant in the cattle business needed to learn land management and not just the open range. He was 30 years old. She was 28. These facts established themselves quietly in the background of their working days, without either of them calling attention to them. Georgia learned things about running the farm more efficiently from watching Abel, and she would not have admitted this to anyone else, but she admitted it to herself, because she was honest in that particular way of people who have nobody left to perform for. He knew cattle deeply, in the particular language of a man who had spent years with them, and he reorganized the grazing rotation in a way that immediately showed benefits, the winter wheat coming in stronger, the pasture recovering faster. He fixed the barn roof before the first autumn rains came through. He dealt with Cutter Price from the Aldridge Ranch in a single conversation that apparently made a lasting impression, because the Aldridge cattle stopped appearing on Georgia's land entirely. She didn't ask what was said. She figured it was the kind of conversation best not examined too closely. Abel learned things about Georgia too. He learned that she was methodical to a degree that approached artistry, that she kept records of every expense and every yield in a ledger that Robert had started, and she had continued in her own smaller, more precise handwriting. He learned that she was not sentimental in the weak way, that she could make difficult decisions about the livestock without flinching, but that she sometimes sat in the evening on the porch with a look on her face that was not sadness exactly, but something older and quieter. He learned that Nora was the center of Georgia's world in a way that was not clinging, but rather purposeful, that Georgia was raising her daughter with the specific intention of producing a person who could stand on her own. He respected that. He respected most things about Georgia Lockhart, and this respect had a quality he had not entirely expected, which was that it was becoming something more than respect, gradually and without his permission. He noticed the way she moved through the farm, purposeful and aware, her hands always occupied, her eyes always reading the land for what it needed. He noticed that when she laughed, which was not often but was not never, it was a full and genuine sound that started in her chest and arrived without apology. He noticed that she had opinions about things ranging from land management to territorial politics to the proper way to make a pie crust, and that these opinions were always grounded in thought and observation rather than repetition of things she'd been told. He did not say any of this. He was not the kind of man who said such things easily or quickly, and there was something more significant stopping him, which was that Georgia was a widow with a child and a farm and a life she had built alone out of the rubble of loss, and the last thing she needed was a hired hand developing feelings for her that would complicate everything. So he kept his noticing private and focused on the work, and the weeks became a month, and the month became two. On the first truly cold morning of October, Georgia came to the barn to find that one of her cows had gone into early labor and was in difficulty. She had seen difficult births before, but this one was bad. The calf malpresented, and she was already in it with her arm when Abel arrived, and they worked together through the cold morning in the particular focus of emergency. And when they finally got the calf out alive and watched it find its uncertain legs on the straw, Georgia sat back against the stall wall and covered her face with her hands for a moment that had nothing to do with weakness. Abel sat down on the other side of the stall and said nothing. He understood the kind of crying that was just the body releasing pressure rather than the person falling apart, and he gave her the silence of someone who was not uncomfortable with it. After a moment, she took her hands away and looked at him. Her eyes were wet and her face was dirt-streaked, and she still had her sleeves rolled up past the elbows. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't need me," he said. "You would have gotten it." "It would have taken longer," she said. "It might not have made it." He nodded. They looked at the calf, who was making the wobbling, determined attempt at standing that was one of the more encouraging sights a working farm could offer. "I didn't expect to like this work as much as I do," Abel said after a while, and he wasn't sure why he said it. It just came out with the kind of honesty that cold mornings and shared emergencies produce. Georgia looked at him. "The cattle work, the whole of it," he said. He looked at the barn, at the light coming through the gaps in the boards, at the calf finding its feet, at her, being somewhere settled. Georgia was quiet for a moment. "You could find somewhere settled," she said carefully. "A man your age with your skills could buy a good piece of land." "I know it," he said. He left it there, not saying the rest of what was in him, which was that the idea of finding somewhere settled had become inseparable in his mind from the idea of this particular somewhere, which was a thing he had no right to say yet, and possibly no right to feel. The fall settled in hard and cold, and the work did not ease, but the rhythm of it had become comfortable in the way that things become comfortable when they fit together well. Georgia and Abel worked side by side most days with a naturalness that Nora had begun to take for granted, and that Edna Marsh, who came by for a visit in late October, observed with a measuring eye and a comment at the gate that Georgia chose not to dignify with a response. But Edna's comment stayed with her. "You look different," Edna had said. "Not worn out different, just different." And when Georgia sat on the porch in the evenings and the cold air came off the plains and Abel was inside the barn doing end-of-day checks, she sat with Edna's observation and tried to examine it honestly. She missed Robert. She would miss Robert for the rest of her life in the particular constant way that you miss a limb, not because it stops you from living, but because its absence is always there at the edge of your awareness. Robert had been her partner in the true sense, her choice and her anchor, and losing him at 31 to a fever that took him in 3 days had been the kind of destruction she had not known how to survive except by putting one foot in front of the other and refusing to stop. But she was alive, and she was 28, and she was not the same person she had been when Robert was alive. She had been changed by the 14 months alone, changed by the necessity of becoming sufficient unto herself, changed by the fence posts and the cattle and the ledger and the mornings she woke up alone and had to make herself get up anyway. And Abel Haskins was in her barn, and in her days, and increasingly in the kind of private thoughts she was not sure she was ready to examine in full light. She did not do anything about this. She was Georgia Lockhart, and she was deliberate about things that mattered, and this mattered. And she did not believe in being hurried by feelings she hadn't yet fully understood. It was Nora who said it first, in the way that children say things that adults dance around. She was at the kitchen table one evening doing the arithmetic Georgia set her every night, because the school in Clarendon was 6 miles away and Georgia couldn't always get her there and back. So she schooled her daughter in the evenings with a determination that would have done credit to any actual schoolteacher. "Do you like Abel?" Nora asked, not looking up from her figures. Georgia did not startle easily. "He's a good worker," she said. Nora looked up then, and she had Robert's eyes, brown and direct and not fooled by anything. "That's not what I asked," she said. Georgia looked at her daughter. "No," she said, "it's not." She paused. "He's a good man," she said, which was closer to the truth. She was not quite ready to speak. Nora returned to her arithmetic. "He fixed my boot last week," she said. "Without my asking, he just found it and fixed it and put it back." Georgia had not known that. She absorbed it. "He's kind," Nora said. "Papa was kind." Georgia's throat tightened. "Papa was very kind," she said quietly. Nora did not say anything else, but Georgia understood that her daughter had given her something, had handed her a kind of permission in the small currency of a child who misses her father, but is also 10 years old and still hopes that the world can be good again. Georgia did not rush, but she stopped turning away from what she felt. The occasion that broke the formal distance between them was not dramatic. It was a Sunday in late October, the work lighter than other days, and Georgia had asked Abel if he wanted to come into Clarendon with her and Nora for the Sunday service, because the reverend at the Clarendon church was a reasonable man, and the congregation was made up of the working people of the county who had generally treated Georgia with the straightforward kindness that hard-working communities extend to their own. He said yes, and on the road into town in the wagon with Nora sitting between them and the cold plains wind coming off the northwest, and the sky gray and enormous overhead, something settled between them that had not been settled before. Nothing was said that hadn't been said before, but there was a quality to the silence that was different, a warmth under the cold air, a kind of ease that had crossed some invisible line into something more than coworkers, more than employer and hired hand. After the service, while Nora was talking with the Reverend's daughter, who was her particular friend, Georgia and Abel stood in the churchyard with cups of coffee that the Reverend's wife dispensed from a large pot after services, and Georgia said, without looking at him, "I find myself glad you stayed." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet she had learned to trust. "I find myself glad I stayed too," he said. She looked at him then, and he looked at her, and the thing that had been building for 2 months acknowledged itself between them without either of them saying exactly what it was. But it was there, solid and real, and Georgia knew it the way she knew the quality of soil and the integrity of a fence post, by the particular certainty that came from paying honest attention. November brought a cold that had teeth, and the work of the farm in winter was different from fall work, more about maintenance and survival, and keeping the livestock alive through the long gray stretches between feed deliveries. Abel proved himself invaluable in ways that continued to surprise her, not because she had doubted his competence, but because there were always new situations, and he met them all with the same steady readiness. One afternoon a week into November, a man came to the property gate on a good horse with the look of someone whose clothes cost more than George's monthly expenses. He introduced himself as Harrison Aldridge, the owner of the Aldridge Ranch, not the foreman but the man himself, which was a surprise since, in her experience, landowners sent their men to deal with neighboring concerns. He was perhaps 45, with the kind of authority that came from generations of it rather than anything he'd earned personally, and he spoke to Georgia with a courtesy that she recognized as the courtesy men used with women, They considered objects to be managed rather than people to be talked to. He told her that he'd been hearing good things about her land management. He told her that he had an offer to make for her property. He told her the number, which was not an entirely unreasonable number, but was below what the land was worth, and he said it with the confidence of a man who expected the answer to be yes. Georgia listened. She looked at him. She said, "No, thank you." He had not expected that. She watched him revise his approach in real time, shift from confident to persuasive, tell her about the challenges of running a farm alone, about the difficulty of the coming winter, about the opportunities she could find elsewhere with the money he was offering. Abel was behind her, slightly to the left, not saying anything. She was aware of him the way you are aware of a solid thing in the dark, by the reassurance of its presence. "Mr. Aldridge," Georgia said, "my husband bought this land with his savings from 6 years of working someone else's ranch. He built the house himself. My daughter was born here. I set 43 fence posts on that property line myself 3 months ago, and I set the last 11 with help, and every one of them is solid and straight. This land is mine and it is not for sale. I'd appreciate you not asking again." Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Abel, who met his eyes without hostility but also without any give in them. He looked at the farm, the tidily maintained fields, the solid barn, the fence line running clean and straight across the eastern boundary. He tipped his hat. He rode away. Georgia stood at the gate for a moment after he was gone. She felt her heartbeat returning to normal. "He'll send someone back," Abel said quietly. "Men like that don't hear no as permanent." "Let him," Georgia said. "I'll keep saying it." Abel looked at her with something in his expression that she was beginning to recognize as the closest he came to showing what he felt. "I know you will," he said. He had spoken it simply, with a certainty that was not flattery but conviction, and it landed in her chest like something warm. Aldridge did send someone back, as Abel had predicted. Cutter Price appeared at the property 2 days later with a revised number on a piece of paper, and an attitude that was less polite than his employer's had been. He caught Georgia at the barn alone, which she suspected was intentional, and he leaned against the door frame and talked to her in the slow, patient way she had already encountered from him, and had already decided she would not tolerate indefinitely. Abel came in from the far pasture while Price was still talking, and there was a brief exchange that Georgia did not quite hear all of, but the tone of it was clear enough, and Price left without the piece of paper and without the courtesy of a farewell to Georgia. "What did you say to him?" she asked. Abel was checking the water level in the trough and didn't turn around. "Nothing that isn't true," he said. She waited. He turned around. "I told him that this farm has a working ranch hand who knows the land and will be here through the winter, and that the owner is not interested in selling, and that if Mr. Aldridge has further concerns he should bring them to her directly and in daylight where she can see his face." Georgia considered this. "That's diplomatically worded," she said. "I was trying to be diplomatic," he said. She looked at him. There was something in the set of his shoulders, a tension that had been there when she came in and was still there, and she understood that it was the tension of a man who had kept himself from saying considerably more than he'd said. "Thank you," she said, "for the diplomacy." He nodded. The tension eased a little. "Abel," she said. He looked at her. "I notice that you are here. I want you to know I notice." He was quiet for a long moment. "Georgia," he said, and the way he said her name was different from the careful, neutral way he'd said it for weeks. It had a quality of acknowledgement in it, of something finally said out loud. "We should probably talk," she said. "We probably should," he said. They talked that evening after Nora was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the wind talking to itself outside the windows. It was not the kind of talk that was easy to begin or easy to navigate, because there was grief in the room from the start. Robert's ghost not malevolent but present. The weight of what had been lost shaping the space in which what might be found was trying to grow. Georgia told him about Robert without sentimentality but with full honesty, about who he had been and what he had meant, and what losing him had done to her. She told him about the first 6 months of trying to hold the farm together while also trying to hold herself together, about the mornings she had stood in the kitchen with no idea how to begin the day, and had eventually begun it anyway because Nora needed breakfast. She told him that she was not finished grieving, that she did not think she would ever be fully finished, but that she had learned the grief was not incompatible with living, with wanting more living. Abel listened the way he did everything, with complete and patient attention, and when she had said what she needed to say, he was quiet for a moment, and then he talked about his own life with the same honesty she had offered him. He had never been married. He had come close once, a woman in Abilene named Clara who had been waiting for him to stop moving, and he had never stopped moving, and she had eventually not waited. He had understood at the time but had carried it with him, the knowledge that his restlessness had cost him something real. He said that when he came to this farm and saw Georgia at the fence line, covered in dust with blood on her hands and that mallet held like she intended to use it on whatever the world sent next, something in him had recognized something he hadn't known he was looking for. "I'm not restless now," he said. "I want you to know that. This isn't me stopping in for the winter and moving on in spring." Georgia looked at him across the lamplight. "How do I know that?" she asked, and it was a genuine question, not hostile. "You don't," he said. "Not yet. I know it doesn't come from one honest conversation, it comes from time." She nodded. That was the right answer. She had not expected anything else, but she had needed to ask. "Then we take time," she said. He nodded. "That's all I'm asking." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers for a moment, and it was the first time she had touched him deliberately, and for its own sake rather than as the accidental contact of work, and she felt the warmth of it travel all the way up her arm and settle somewhere central. Then she took her hand back and said good night, and he went out to the barn, and she sat alone at the kitchen table for a while with the lamp and the wind, and the particular feeling of a door opening that she had thought was permanently closed. The winter deepened. They worked and they talked, in the evenings when there was time, in the pauses between tasks, and what they built in those conversations was the particular knowledge of a person that is different from admiration or attraction, which was that she knew what made him laugh and what made him serious and what he cared about deeply and what he was uncertain about. She knew that he sent money home to his mother in Kansas every month, and that this was a thing he did without being asked and without mentioning. She knew he could read, which was not universal among men of his background, and that he read carefully, the same way he worked and listened, with full attention. She knew he was gentle with the animals in a way that went beyond practical, that he spoke to the horses in a low voice when he was grooming them, not sweet talk but something more like conversation. He knew her too, in the specific and accumulated way that daily proximity produces. He knew when she was worried about the accounts by the way she held her pencil. He knew when she was missing Robert by a particular quality of stillness that came over her in the evenings. He knew that she allowed herself to be moved by beautiful things, a good sunset, an unexpectedly successful crop, Nora learning something new, and that she did not perform this emotion but simply felt it and did not try to hide it. December brought its particular hardships, and they met them together. A blizzard in the second week that kept them all inside for 3 days and changed the dynamic of close quarters in ways that were both revealing and clarifying. Because people who can spend 3 days confined in a small house together without significant friction have something genuine between them. Nora, who had been cautious but not hostile, seemed to arrive during those 3 days at a settled acceptance of Abel's presence that was something more than tolerance. She asked him to help her with the arithmetic she found most difficult, and he did it without condescension, sitting at the table with her and working through the problems in a way that was patient and thorough. And Georgia watched from the other side of the room with something in her chest that she recognized as longing of the most specific and tender kind. When the blizzard broke and they went out together to dig through to the barn and check on the animals, and the world outside was white and silent and enormous, Nora ran ahead through the snow, and Abel and Georgia walked side by side with their breath making clouds in the air, and he took her hand. It was matter of fact, not theatrical. He just reached over and took her hand the way you take something you've been meaning to take for a while and finally decide to. And she did not pull away but instead laced her fingers through his, and they walked to the barn like that, through the white silence of the Texas panhandle after a blizzard, and it was one of the simplest and most significant things she had felt in a very long time. Nothing was said about it. There was nothing that needed saying in that moment. The hand said enough. Christmas came and Georgia made it meaningful for Nora with what she had, which was considerable given her organization and her skill in the kitchen, and Abel contributed by carving Nora a small painted horse that was good enough to reveal a talent he had not mentioned. Nora received it with the particular reverence children reserve for things made by hand specifically for them, and she put it on the shelf above her bed where she could see it from her pillow. After Nora was in bed, Georgia and Abel sat by the fire, and she gave him a pair of gloves she had made herself in the evenings over the past 3 weeks, leather and wool, fitted to his hands because she had measured them while he slept one afternoon after a long work morning, and he held them for a moment before putting them on and looking at them on his hands. "They fit perfectly," he said. "I measured carefully," she said. He looked at her with the full weight of everything he felt, which was considerable, and she looked back at him, and then he leaned forward and kissed her, finally, after months of proximity and work and honesty and the slow, certain building of something real. It was a careful kiss, gentle and sure, the kind that asks a question and waits for the answer, and her answer was to stay there, her hands on his jaw, the fire warm on their faces, the wind outside finding no purchase on them at all. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers, and she kept her hands on his face, and they stayed like that for a while, not speaking, in the particular communion that comes after a first kiss that has been a long time in arriving. "I love you," he said. He said it quietly, without drama, but with the certainty of a man who has examined a thing thoroughly before stating it. She was quiet for a moment, not uncertain, just giving it the weight it deserved. "I love you," she said back, and she said it with the same weight, the same certainty, because she had been honest her whole life and she was not going to be less than honest about this. The new year came in cold and quiet, the first day of 1884 dawning over the panhandle with a pale blue sky and a hard frost on everything. And Georgia stood on the porch with her coffee and looked at her land, the fields and the barn and the fence line running straight along the eastern boundary, every post solid in the frozen ground, and she felt for the first time in a long time that the future was not just a thing she was enduring but a thing she was building toward. Abel came out and stood beside her with his coffee, and she leaned against him slightly, naturally, without thinking about it, and he put his arm around her and they stood like that in the cold morning looking at the land. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked up at him. "I want to ask you properly," he said. "When the time is right. I'm not in a hurry for the question itself, but I want you to know I intend to ask it." Georgia understood what he was saying. She understood the particular care of it, the way he was giving her time to prepare, time to decide, not rushing her with the momentum of feeling. "I'll be ready when you ask it," she said, and she meant that in all its fullness, that she was moving toward yes and she wanted him to know it. He tightened his arm around her, and they stood in the cold panhandle morning and drank their coffee and watched the new year begin. January and February tested them with the specific cruelty of Texas winters on the open plain, ice storms that turned the ground to iron and wind that came off the Llano Estacado like something with intent. They lost 2 calves that could not be saved, and it was the kind of loss that sits in the chest for days, and Georgia and Abel both carried it in the silent way of people who respect what they have lost without indulging in excessive display. But the herd overall survived well. The feeding schedule Abel had organized in the fall proved its worth in the winter, and when March came and the ground began to soften and the first reluctant green appeared in the wheat fields, Georgia looked at her accounts and found them in better shape than they had been at any point since Robert's death. Not comfortable, Not safe, not without worry, but better. Genuinely better. She sat with the ledger and let herself feel that for a moment without immediately moving on to the next concern, which was a thing she had been teaching herself, the small discipline of acknowledging good things. Abel found her like that, at the table with the ledger open, a small unguarded look on her face that she didn't bother to hide from him. "Good news?" he asked. "Better news," she said. "Not good yet. Better." He sat down across from her, and she turned the ledger and he looked at the numbers with the same attention he brought to everything, and she watched him follow the columns and understand the story they told. "You've made this work," he said. "We've made this work," she said. He looked up. "You were making it work before I got here," he said. "I just helped." "You helped considerably," she said. "Stop being modest." He smiled, one of his rare full smiles that changed his whole face, and she felt it the way she always felt it, like warmth landing. Spring was the beginning of a new urgency on the farm, planting and calving, and all the intense, simultaneous labor of the season. And they moved through it together with the efficiency of people who know each other's rhythms without needing to discuss them. Nora, on the days she didn't make the ride to school, worked alongside them with the cheerful industriousness of a child who has been raised to understand that a farm is a shared project. In late March, Edna Marsh came over for a longer visit and found Georgia in the garden and sat on the fence rail and looked at her with the assessing eye she had developed over decades of watching other people's lives from a position of hard-won wisdom. "You're happy," Edna said, as if diagnosing something. "I am," Georgia said, "mostly, as much as seems right." Edna nodded. "Robert would want you to be more than mostly," she said, and this was the most direct either of them had been about it, and Georgia straightened and looked at Edna and found only honesty in her face. "I know," Georgia said. "He was a good man," Edna said. "Good men don't want to leave widows behind. They don't want you to stop." Georgia looked at the garden for a moment. "Abel is a good man too," she said. "Different kind of good," Edna said. "But yes," Georgia looked at her. "You've talked to him." "He helped me repair my porch steps last week," Edna said with complete composure. "We talk some. He's direct, which I appreciate. He told me he intended to ask you to marry him in the spring." Georgia absorbed this. "He told you that?" "He did. He said he wanted to be sure he had the right people thinking well of him before he asked. I think he was asking my opinion of the matter." "What did you tell him?" Georgia asked. Edna looked at her with those decades-worn eyes. "I told him that Georgia Lockhart had put every fence post on her own property line herself, and she would put him in the ground alongside them if he ever gave her reason. He said he understood that and had no intention of giving her reason." Georgia laughed, a full and genuine laugh that startled a pair of birds from the fence rail, and Edna laughed too, and for a moment the spring air around them was bright with it. Abel asked her on an evening in April when the farm smelled of new grass, and the sky was going orange and gold, and Nora was at the Marsh place for a night visit as she occasionally was. He had cleaned up and changed his shirt, which she noticed, and he had a particular quality of settled resolve about him that she recognized as the quality he got when he had made up his mind about something completely. They were sitting on the porch, and the evening was warm enough for sitting outside, and she had a cup of tea and he had coffee, and the land stretched out in front of them in the particular golden light that made even flat country look beautiful. "I want to ask you that question now," he said. She looked at him. Her heart was steady and warm. He turned to face her, his elbows on his knees, looking at her directly in the way he had looked at her from that first afternoon at the fence line, with full and unperforming attention. "Georgia," he said, "I came to your property line on a September afternoon and you were setting fence posts and you told me you'd learned from necessity, and I have thought about that answer every single day since because I know what necessity costs. I know what it takes to become the person necessity requires you to be, and I have watched you be that person every single day with a grace and a strength that I love more than I know how to say." He paused. "I love you. I love Nora. I love this land and this life, and I want to spend mine here with you if you'll have me. Will you marry me?" Georgia felt everything in her chest, all of it at once. The grief that was still there and the love that was also there, and the way those two things existed together without canceling each other. And her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "Yes," she said. "Abel Haskins, yes." He put his hand to her face and she leaned into it, and for a moment they were still in the golden light. And then she took his hand in both of hers and held it and smiled at him. And his answering smile was the full, rare, face-changing one. And she thought she would spend the rest of her life trying to earn that smile regularly. They were married in June of 1884 in the Clarendon Church, with Reverend Mills presiding, and Edna Marsh as witness, and Nora in a new dress that Georgia had made from fabric saved for the occasion, standing beside her mother with the serious dignity of a child who understood the weight of what was happening. The congregation was small. The people who knew Georgia and who had watched her hold the farm together for the past 2 years, and they watched the ceremony with the particular warmth of communities that want things to work out. Abel said his vows in a steady voice with his eyes on Georgia's face the entire time, and Georgia said hers the same way. And when Reverend Mills pronounced them married and Abel kissed his wife, there was a genuine spontaneous cheer from the small gathered congregation that made Nora cover her mouth with her hand to hide her smile. Edna Marsh brought a cake that she had made from a recipe that had been in her family for 30 years, and they ate it on the church steps in the June afternoon, and Georgia held Abel's hand and leaned against his shoulder and looked at her daughter laughing with the Reverend's girls, and felt the particular fullness of a life that was genuinely, concretely good. The summer of 1884 was a good one for the farm. The wheat came in strong. The cattle had a favorable season. Abel's reorganization of the grazing patterns continued to show results, and by August the ledger told a story of actual modest profit, not just survival, and Georgia and Abel sat with it together at the kitchen table and looked at the numbers and let themselves feel the satisfaction of work that had paid off. Harrison Aldridge did not come back himself, but a letter arrived in September, a third offer for the property, this one through a lawyer in Amarillo, and Georgia wrote back in her precise small handwriting that the property was not for sale, had never been for sale, and would not be for sale, and she appreciated the gentleman refraining from further inquiry on the matter. She did not consult Abel before writing the letter because she did not need to, but she showed it to him after. He read it and looked at her and said, "That's direct." "I have been direct about it 3 times now," she said. "I don't believe in unclear messages." He laughed. She loved making him laugh. It was becoming one of her private projects, and she was getting better at it. Nora adjusted to having Abel as her stepfather with the particular adaptation of a child who had been loved securely enough to have room for additional love, and the relationship between them developed its own quality, different from the relationship she'd had with Robert but genuine and growing. Abel taught her to ride properly, which Robert had started but not finished, and Nora took to it with a natural ease that was unmistakably inherited from her mother's relationship with the physical world. Abel also continued the arithmetic help that had started in the blizzard, and by fall Nora was ahead of the other children her age in figures, which she accepted with a quiet pride that was very like her mother. Georgia noticed that Abel spoke to Nora about Robert without discomfort, that when Nora brought up her father in the natural way children do, Abel listened and responded with an ease that confirmed what Georgia had already known about his character, that he was not threatened by what had been, that he understood his place in this family was its own thing and not a replacement. She loved him for that, among many things. October of 1884 came with the anniversary of the fence posts, and Georgia found herself at the property line one morning standing in front of them and remembering. They were still good. The cedar posts she had set were holding, and the ones Abel had helped her with that first afternoon were holding too, solid in the ground, each one the particular shade of weathered gray that cedar turns after a year of weather. Abel came to find her there and stood beside her without asking what she was thinking about, because by now he had learned to read the meaning of where she chose to be. "Good fence," he said after a while. "Good fence," she agreed. He put his arm around her shoulders. "I'm glad you were setting it that afternoon," he said. "I'm glad I stopped." She looked up at him. "I'm glad you asked that question," she said. He looked puzzled for a moment. "Which question?" "Where I learned," she said. "You asked where I learned to set fence posts. Most people would have just watched or commented or ridden on. You asked." He considered this. "I asked because I wanted to know," he said, which was typically simple and typically him. "I know," she said. "That was the thing." He looked at the fence, then back at her, and she saw him understand what she meant, understand the particular significance of being asked rather than told, of having your competence treated as something worthy of curiosity rather than something to be managed or praised indifferently. She had told him necessity, and he had heard it, and he had stayed. She leaned into him and he held her, and the Texas sky was enormous above them, the way it always was, making them both feel small and magnificent simultaneously, and the fence line ran straight and solid along the eastern boundary of their land, every post a record of what necessity and will and a single honest afternoon could build. By spring of 1885, Georgia knew she was expecting. She told Abel on a Sunday morning before the rest of the world was awake, in the quiet kitchen with the early light coming through the east window, sitting across from him with her tea and watching his face as she said it. His face did not go through a dramatic sequence. It just went still for a moment, and then something came into it that was so simply and entirely joy that she could not look at it without her own eyes getting wet. "Georgia," he said. "I know," she said. He came around the table and knelt beside her chair in the way men do when they need to be close to the thing they're grateful for, and he held her hands and looked at her, and she saw everything in him. The man from the road and the man who had worked beside her through a hard winter and the man who had kissed her by a Christmas fire and asked her properly on an April porch and married her in June and learned to be a father to Nora, all of that, all of him looking at her. "Are you well?" He asked. "How are you feeling?" "I'm fine," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, mostly fine." "You'll let me know when you need me to take on more," he said. "You won't try to do everything regardless." She smiled at him. "I'll try not to," she said. "I know better than to ask for promises," he said, and she laughed because he did know better, and the fact that he knew her that well was one of the continuous small graces of this life. Nora received the news with 10-year-old gravity, and then 11-year-old practicality, because her birthday was in March and the baby was due in November. And she asked a series of sensible questions about sleeping arrangements and her own responsibilities, and whether she would be expected to help with the baby. And Georgia told her she would be expected to help with whatever she was capable of helping with. And Nora nodded as if a business arrangement had been satisfactorily concluded. "I'll be a good older sister," she said, with the particular earnest certainty of a child making a real commitment. "I know you will," Georgia said. "Papa Robert would be glad," Nora said. She had started calling him Papa Robert after Abel came, distinguishing them, creating a language for the two fathers who occupied different spaces in her life. Abel had accepted this without comment, understanding the wisdom in it. "Yes," Georgia said softly, "he would." The pregnancy was not easy in all its particulars. The summer heat was the difficulty, and the physical demands of the farm could not simply be set aside. But Abel was as good as his word in absorbing the heavier work without commentary or implication, without making her feel that she had become a burden or a limitation. He managed the morning milking entirely, and the heavier lifting without being asked, and he checked on her with a regularity that was caring without being smothering. In August, when the heat was at its worst and she was at 6 months and finding the days long, she came out one morning to find that he had rigged a canvas awning over the kitchen garden so that she could work in the garden in shade during the morning, the time she liked best for it. He had done it before she was up, which was itself unusual since she was typically up first. She stood looking at it for a moment before he came up behind her. "You rigged that," she said. "It needed doing," he said. She turned and looked at him, and he had the slightly self-conscious look he got when he had done something that risked being called sentimental. "It's a practical solution to the heat," he said. "It is," she agreed. "A very practical and thoughtful solution." She put her hand on his chest and felt his heartbeat steady and sure. "Thank you." "Don't make it a thing," he said. "I'm not making it a thing," she said. "I'm thanking my husband." He put his hand over hers on his chest, and they stood like that for a moment in the early morning before the heat came in properly, and the canvas awning moved slightly in the small breeze, and the world was quiet and good. Their son was born on a November evening in 1885, delivered by the midwife from Clarendon named Mrs. Dunbar, who was practical and experienced, and who took charge of the proceedings with a no-nonsense authority that Georgia appreciated. Abel was in the house in the main room, which was not the usual arrangement but which nobody suggested against, and when Mrs. Dunbar brought the baby out and told him he had a son, he was quiet for a long moment and then said, in a voice that was not entirely steady, "Is Georgia all right?" "She's tired and she's well," Mrs. Dunbar said, "and she's asking for you." He went in, and Georgia was propped against the pillows with the exhausted and luminous look of a woman who has just done the hardest and most extraordinary thing a body can do, and the baby was in her arms wrapped in the blue flannel they had prepared, and she looked up at Abel when he came in and said, "Come and meet your son." He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held him with the careful, experienced steadiness of a man who had handled small and fragile things before, and he looked at his son's face, red and furious and new, and Georgia watched him fall completely and without reservation in love. They named him Robert James Haskins. Robert for the father who had given this farm its beginning, and James for Abel's own father who had died when he was 12. Abel had suggested the name quietly, offering it like a gift, and Georgia had held it for a moment and understood all the things it was saying, about memory and respect, and the way love can accommodate the past without being diminished by it. Nora received her brother with the focused solemnity of a new older sibling, confronting the reality of a smaller person who cannot yet be talked to. And within 2 days, she had established herself as his most devoted protector, stationing herself near him with a watchful attention that made Georgia smile every time she saw it. Life with a new baby on a working farm in the Texas Panhandle in the winter of 1885 was its own particular demanding thing, but they met it with the same reliable combination that had carried them through everything else, which was honest work and honest communication, and a genuine respect for each other that never went through the motions. Abel woke for night feedings without being asked, which was not universal among men of his time and background, and he took the night shifts when Georgia was most exhausted with the same matter-of-fact approach he brought to morning chores, which was that it needed doing and he was here to do it. Georgia, recovering and nursing and managing the household, also kept the accounts and managed the decisions and consulted with Abel on the major determinations the way she had always done, as a partner rather than a dependent. This was the quality of their life together, that partnership, real and earned, built from months of working side by side before any of the tender things were said. Robert James, who quickly became simply James at the instigation of Nora, who said it was more dignified, proved to be a contented baby with dark eyes like his father and his mother's particular directness of expression, and he grew through the winter into the spring of 1886 with a steadiness that was comforting. The farm continued to improve. Abel had been making improvements to the water access since the previous year, working on a secondary water source that would reduce their dependence on the single well and make the property more resilient in dry periods. And this project came to completion in the spring of 1886, with results that were immediately visible in the condition of the pastures. Georgia stood looking at the new water line one April morning and did her own calculation of what it meant, not just for the current season but for the years ahead, and she felt the kind of satisfaction that is specifically about building something that will last. "You're proud," Abel said, coming up beside her. "I'm proud of us," she said. "It's different." "It is different," he agreed. She looked at him. He had grown more settled in the past 2 years. The slightly migratory quality she'd noticed in him that first afternoon had given way to the particular rootedness of a man who has found his ground. There was still the readiness in him, the capability for hard work and decisive action, but it was grounded now in place and people, in this land and this family. "Do you miss the moving?" she asked. It was something she had wondered but not asked. He thought about it, which she appreciated. He didn't give a reflexive answer. "Sometimes I miss the feeling of the trail," he said, "the openness of it, but I'd rather have this." He looked at the farm, at the water line, at the house where Nora was visible through the kitchen window and the sound of James somewhere behind the barn could be heard. "There's no contest." She put her hand in his. "Good," she said. He squeezed her hand. "Good," he agreed. By summer of 1886, Nora was 12 and was riding to school on her own horse. A bay mare Abel had gotten her for her birthday and trained to her specifically. And Georgia watched her daughter ride down the property track on school mornings with the complicated feeling of a mother watching her child become a person, proud and wistful and glad. Harrison Aldridge died in the summer of 1886 of a heart complaint, and the Aldridge ranch changed hands to a younger man named Porter who had different ideas about the operation, and who came to introduce himself properly to his neighboring landowners, including Georgia and Abel, and who turned out to be a reasonable and practical man who had no designs on their land, and who was genuinely interested in the cooperative management of the county's grazing resources. Cutter Price left the Aldridge operation with the change of ownership, and Georgia allowed herself a moment of private satisfaction about this. Life settled into the rhythms of a working farm family in the growing years of the Texas Panhandle, where the cattle business was changing, and the towns were growing, and the open range was slowly giving way to fenced range throughout the territory. Abel watched these changes with the informed eye of a man who had seen the industry from both sides, and he adapted the farm's operation accordingly, staying ahead of what was coming. In the spring of 1887, when James was 18 months old and Nora was 12, and the farm was in its best condition it had ever been, Georgia found herself pregnant again. She was 31 years old and in full and capable health, and she received the news with the uncomplicated gratitude of a woman who has enough of what she needs to welcome what is coming. She told Abel at the kitchen table again, the same way she had told him about James, in the early morning quiet before the day began. His response was the same, the stillness followed by joy, except this time he reached for her immediately and held her in the direct physical way that was his particular language of feeling, arms around her, solid and sure. "Are you happy?" he asked against her hair. "I am," she said into his shoulder. "Entirely." The second child came in October of 1887, a girl this time, born on a bright cold morning with the same efficiency that Mrs. Dunbar always brought to the proceedings, and she came into the world with her mother's directness, crying with immediate and full-throated intention, and then subsiding into a focused alertness that made Mrs. Dunbar say she had the eyes of a woman who has things to sort out. They named her Clara, not after Abel's Abilene Clara, but because Georgia had always liked the name and said so, and Abel agreed, and the name was its own thing, clean and clear and belonging entirely to this new person. James, now a toddler with his father's steady nature and his mother's methodical attention to everything around him, received his sister with a scientist's interest, peering at her with great concentration and occasionally offering his small hand which she gripped with newborn strength. Nora, who was 13 by the time Clara was well established in the household, took on the role of eldest with a seriousness that Georgia had expected and a tenderness she had hoped for. She read to Clara in the evenings, and she kept a close watch on James when both parents were occupied. And she was growing into a young woman with her father Robert's calm and her mother's capability, and something that was entirely her own. A kind of steady confidence that Georgia thought was the particular inheritance of a child who has been raised with love and expectation both. On an October evening 2 years after Clara was born, after the children were in bed and the farm was quiet in the dark, and the lamp was on in the kitchen where Georgia was updating the ledger, Abel came in from the last barn check and sat down across from her. He had the look he got when he had been thinking through something. "What?" she said without looking up. "Nothing bad," he said. "I was just thinking." She looked up. "Edna told me this afternoon that she's thinking of selling her place," he said. "She's getting older and she says she'd rather live with her daughter in Amarillo than spend another winter alone." Georgia set down her pencil. Edna Marsh's property bordered theirs to the north. It was good land, similar to their own, well managed. Edna was 71 and the winter had been hard on her. "She's really thinking of selling," Georgia said. "She is. She asked if we'd be interested before she puts it to a land agent." Georgia looked at the ledger. She did the arithmetic in her head the quick fluid way she did arithmetic, and then she looked at Abel. "We could do it," she said. "I think we could," he said. "It would stretch us. First year would be tight." "We've done tight before," she said. "We have," he said. He was watching her face. "If you want to do it." She thought about it. The land, the additional grazing, the water access it would provide, the way it would complete the northern boundary of their property. She thought about the work of it and the expansion of it and what it would mean for Nora and James and Clara, the inheritance it would build. She looked at Abel. "Let's talk to Edna tomorrow," she said. He smiled. "I'll ride over in the morning," he said. "We'll ride over," she said. The acquisition of the Marsh property took 3 months to negotiate and settle, Edna being a careful businesswoman even in her selling as she had been in her owning, and the terms they reached were fair to both parties. And on the day the papers were signed in the land office in Clarendon, Georgia and Abel rode home in the late afternoon light across land that was now undeniably, legally, completely theirs in a way that expanded what theirs meant. Abel pulled the wagon up at the fence line, the original fence line, the one Georgia had replaced 4 years ago with 43 cedar posts and her own determination, and then 11 more with help from a stranger who had stopped on a September afternoon and asked the right question. He climbed down and helped her down, which was a courtesy she accepted without the old resistance, because accepting help from someone you trusted was a different thing entirely from depending on someone you weren't sure of. Nora and James and Clara were at home with the neighbor's girl who sometimes helped when both parents were occupied, and the evening air was cool and smelled of dry grass and cedar, and the sky was the particular deep blue of a Texas evening going toward dark. Georgia walked to the fence line and put her hand on one of the posts she had set herself. The cedar was silver gray with 4 years of weather, solid in the earth, going nowhere. "Still good," Abel said beside her. "Still good," she said. She turned and looked at him in the evening light, this man who had come down the road and stopped and asked a question and stayed, who had worked beside her and loved her and married her and built a life with her that was better and more than anything the frightened, exhausted widow setting fence posts alone in September of 1883 could have imagined for herself. "Abel," she said. He looked at her. "I am glad for every hard thing that made me who I was when you arrived," she said. "And I am glad for you." He put his hand to her face in the way he had done since Christmas of that first year, with the certainty of a man who has found what he was looking for. "Georgia," he said, "I was looking for somewhere to land for 10 years and I didn't know it, and you were standing at a fence line with bloody hands and a mallet, and you said one word that told me everything I needed to know about who you were." "Necessity," she said. "Necessity," he said. "And I thought, this is a woman who knows what it costs to become yourself. And I wanted to stay." He paused. "I'm glad I stayed." She covered his hand with hers, the cold evening air around them, the fence line behind her running straight and cedar gray across the land, the lamp light beginning in the house window in the distance where their children were. "Stay," she said, and it was not a question. "Always," he said, and it was not a promise so much as a statement of the most settled and certain fact of his life. He kissed her in the evening light with the fence post solid behind her, and the Texas sky going dark above them, and the new land stretching north where Edna's place was dark and waiting to become part of their story, and Georgia Lockhart, who had become Georgia Haskins, who had been a widow and had made herself sufficient, and had been found by a good man on an afternoon when she was more covered in dust and determination than anything else, held onto her husband in the cold October air, and felt the full and real and permanent happiness of a life that had been built honestly, post by post, day by day, from necessity into something far beyond necessity, into love. The following spring, with James following his father everywhere on small determined legs, and Clara pulling herself up on furniture with focused effort, and Nora riding out on her mare to the new northern property, to check the fence lines there, because she had been taught what a good fence line looked like, and why it mattered. Georgia was in the kitchen garden in the early morning under the canvas awning that was 3 years old and still doing its job, her hands in the soil, when she heard Abel's voice calling from the barn with a tone that meant something was happening. She got up and went, not running but moving with purpose, and found him in the near paddock with a young horse that had been spooked and tangled in its lead rope, and she went in on one side while he handled the other, and they worked the horse calm with the familiar synchrony that 4 years of shared work had made natural, talking low and steady to the animal and to each other. And when the horse was free and calm, and standing with its sides heaving slightly, Georgia leaned against the paddock fence and looked at Abel. He looked at her across the calmed horse, and he was grinning, the full grin, and she grinned back, and it was not romantic in the obvious sense. There was dirt on both their clothes, and the horse between them was still blowing hard. But it was them, entirely and completely them, and it was the most romantic thing in the world. Summer came and the farm thrived, and the new northern property under Abel's management began showing results that would take years to fully mature, but that had already begun to indicate what they would be, which was excellent. Georgia had begun thinking about putting in a second water line on the northern acreage, and she and Abel had spread the ledger out on a Sunday evening and worked through the numbers together in the lamplight while the children slept, and the numbers were good enough to make it possible within the year, and they had looked at each other over the figures with the particular satisfaction of people who have worked hard in the same direction and can see where it's gotten them. In the October of 1889, 6 years after a stranger came down the road and asked about a fence line, Georgia stood at the property boundary and looked at what she had. 240 acres of her own land, expanded by Edna's 160 to the north. A barn she had mended and maintained and improved. A house that held a family, a husband she loved completely and whose love she trusted completely, 2 children who were theirs together, and one who was hers alone but whom Abel had claimed with his whole heart, and a fence line that ran straight and solid and cedar gray along the eastern boundary, every post a small monument to what it means to stand up and do what has to be done, to meet necessity with skill and will, and to keep your hands steady even when they are bleeding. She was 34 years old. She was a farmer and a mother and a wife, and a woman who had set fence posts alone in the dust when she had to, and had accepted help when it was offered honestly. She was not the woman she had been when Robert died. She was not the woman she had been when Abel stopped on the road. She was the woman she had become through all of it, through grief and work and love, and the long daily practice of a life built with intention. Abel came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she reached up and covered them with her own without turning around. "Thinking," he said. "Taking stock," she said. "Good stock to take," he said. She looked at the fence line, at the post she had set, at the land beyond them and the land behind them and the sky above everything, the enormous Texas sky that made you feel small and magnificent both. "Yes," she said, "the very best." And the evening came down over the Texas Panhandle, the way evenings had been coming down over that country for longer than there were people to see them, steady and golden and wide. And the farm was lit in the last light with a particular warmth that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with what is true, which is that a life built from necessity into love, post by post and day by day, is one of the finest things this hard and beautiful world produces.